A mother's love turned deadly in a quiet New Jersey suburb. Behind closed doors, passion, addiction, and betrayal collided, ending with a child's life stolen by the one who should have protected him. This is the shocking story of Heather Reynolds, the mother who killed for love. The morning of May 23, 2018, began like any other in the quiet suburb of Gloucester Township, Camden County. It was a place where families waved to one another from driveways and children played freely in front yards, far removed from the chaos of nearby Philadelphia. But behind one of those neat rows of homes on a small residential street, an unimaginable tragedy was about to unfold. Just before noon, a 911 call shattered the calm. Heather Reynolds, a young mother, screamed into the phone that her 3-year-old son, Axel, wasn't breathing. Her voice was frantic, broken, and filled with a kind of panic that, to a dispatcher, sounded like every mother's worst nightmare. Within minutes, emergency responders arrived to find Heather clutching her lifeless child in the front yard, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. Paramedics worked desperately, performing CPR, hoping against hope to revive the little boy. But Axel Reynolds was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. His body, pale and motionless, bore no obvious signs of violence. For a moment, everyone believed it was a tragic accident, a case of sudden medical distress or suffocation during sleep. Yet, to the trained eyes of first responders, something felt off. Heather's behavior, though outwardly hysterical, seemed oddly inconsistent. Her emotions swung rapidly, from sobbing uncontrollably to calm indifference, to erratic bursts of conversation about her husband's absence and her confusion over what had happened. It was as though her grief was rehearsed, disjointed, and missing the rawness of genuine loss. As police began their preliminary investigation, Heather repeated her story. She had gone to check on Axel, found him unresponsive in his bed, and immediately called for help. She denied knowing how it could have happened, insisting her son had been fine that morning. Detectives noted the scent of chemicals in the air, faint but noticeable, and a bottle of cleaning solution near the child's bedding. It was brushed off as coincidence, but that detail would later become critical. At the time, Heather was a 41-year-old stay-at-home mother. Her husband, Joseph Reynolds, worked long hours as an employee for a local manufacturing company. He was described by friends as quiet, reliable, and utterly devoted to his family. But beneath the surface of the Reynolds household, something dark was festering. Joseph's long shifts left Heather alone for much of the day, and neighbors would later recall her erratic mood swings. One day friendly and chatty, the next distant, glassy-eyed, and paranoid. What few realized then was that Heather had fallen deep into a dangerous cycle of methamphetamine addiction. Her drug use had started small, a way to stay awake and keep energy up. She once told a friend, but it quickly spiraled into dependency. Along the way, she met a man named Robert Keown, another user whose presence would soon consume her life. Robert was charismatic, wild, and unpredictable, the polar opposite of her steady husband. He promised Heather escape from domestic routine, from loneliness, from responsibility. Their affair ignited like a match in gasoline. Secret meetings, endless drug binges, and whispered promises of running away together. But Axel, her son, was always there, needing her attention, interrupting her highs, tethering her to the reality she was desperate to flee. In the weeks before Axel's death, Heather's friends began to notice disturbing changes. She complained that motherhood was suffocating, that Axel was in the way. One friend, later testifying in court, recalled a conversation where Heather blurted out that things would be easier if Axel wasn't around. At the time, it sounded like the venting of an overwhelmed mother, not a warning of murder. But behind those words lay something far more sinister. When detectives from the Camden County Prosecutor's Office took over the investigation, they quickly realized Heather's version of events didn't add up. The autopsy revealed a startling discovery: traces of isopropyl alcohol on Axel's nose and mouth, an indication that he had been intentionally suffocated. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. Suddenly, what had looked like a tragedy began to resemble a crime scene. Detectives returned to the Reynolds home armed with a search warrant. What they found painted a disturbing picture. Hidden in drawers and beneath clothing were small plastic baggies with methamphetamine residue, burnt foil, and syringes. In the trash, they found torn pages from a notebook, fragments of handwritten messages that mentioned freedom, Robert, and new life. On Heather's phone, text messages revealed an obsession with her lover. She often wrote that she felt trapped and suffocated by motherhood. "He's always there," one message said, referring to Axel. "I can't do this with him around." Joseph Reynolds, blindsided by the investigation, was initially in denial. He couldn't believe his wife, the mother of his child, could be capable of such horror. But as detectives laid out the evidence, he broke down. The reality that his family had been living a double life became undeniable. Joseph told police he had no idea about Heather's affair or her drug use. He had been working double shifts to provide for them, thinking he was doing what was best for his family. When confronted by investigators, Heather denied everything. She maintained that she loved her son and would never harm him. She blamed the chemical traces on cleaning supplies, insisting she had wiped his face with alcohol to cool him down when she found him unresponsive. But her explanation didn't match the forensic evidence. There were no medical conditions that could explain Axel's death. His lungs and airway showed signs of asphyxia. As the weeks turned into months, the case grew darker. Heather was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, endangering the welfare of a child, and drug possession. Her mugshot, blank, distant, emotionless, spread across local media. Neighbors were horrified. Many remembered seeing her playing with Axel in the yard, laughing and holding him close. To imagine that same mother now accused of killing him was almost impossible to comprehend. Yet behind every image of normalcy, there had been a mounting storm. Witnesses described seeing Heather wandering the neighborhood late at night, high on meth, muttering to herself about getting out. Others mentioned she often brought different men to the house when Joseph was working. To them, she seemed lost, a woman hollowed out by addiction, consumed by self-destruction. By the end of 2018, as the legal process began, the truth about Heather Reynolds was no longer that of a grieving mother, but of a woman whose life had become a series of lies. Prosecutors were convinced that Axel's death was not an accident, nor an impulsive act of rage, but a calculated decision by a mother who believed her child stood between her and the man she thought she loved. What investigators still didn't know, however, was how far Heather had gone to protect that secret. Her communications, her behavior after Axel's death, and her relentless pursuit of Robert Keown, even while under investigation, would soon reveal the disturbing extent of her obsession. The tragedy that began with a 911 call was about to unravel into one of the most shocking maternal crimes in Camden County's history. A story not just of murder, but of addiction, betrayal, and a love so twisted it destroyed everything in its path. As Heather Reynolds sat in an interrogation room days after Axel's death, detectives could see the cracks in her composure widening. Her earlier cries had faded into a cold, distant calm. She spoke softly, carefully, as though choosing each word for effect. To the detectives who had spent years studying grief and guilt, this wasn't the reaction of a mother mourning her only child. It was the performance of a woman desperate to control a narrative that was quickly slipping away. When investigators confronted her with the medical examiner's findings, traces of isopropyl alcohol on Axel's face, the signs of asphyxiation, Heather's response was flat. "That's impossible," she insisted. "I would never hurt my son. He was everything to me." But the emptiness in her tone betrayed something else entirely. In the days that followed, detectives delved into Heather's private world. What they uncovered was a tangled web of lies, obsession, and drug addiction that painted a disturbing picture of her final months with Axel. Through text messages, phone records, and testimony from friends, a clear pattern emerged. Heather had become consumed by her affair with Robert Keown, a fellow addict she had met through a mutual acquaintance in Camden's drug scene. Robert was reckless, impulsive, and manipulative, but to Heather, he represented escape, freedom from the monotony of her suburban life and the demands of motherhood. Together, they used methamphetamine almost daily, often meeting in motel rooms or parked cars while Joseph was at work. Their relationship was volatile, swinging between passion and chaos. Robert frequently vanished for days, leaving Heather frantic, only to return with promises of a future together. In one recovered text message, Heather pleaded, "I can't lose you. I'll fix everything. I'll make it right." Investigators would later interpret that message as the moment she began rationalizing the unthinkable. Axel, her son, had become the obstacle to the life she wanted with Robert. Whenever she talked about wanting to be free, she wasn't referring to her marriage. She was talking about her child. Neighbors recalled hearing shouting coming from the Reynolds house in the weeks before the tragedy. On one occasion, a neighbor saw Heather pacing in her driveway, clutching her phone, muttering angrily before driving off at high speed. Another remembered seeing Axel at a park with his mother. The boy seemed withdrawn, clinging to her leg as she scrolled through her phone, barely acknowledging him. Even during those public moments, witnesses said, Heather seemed detached, there but not really present. When the prosecution began building its case, they reconstructed a disturbing timeline. On the night before Axel's death, Heather had argued with Robert through a string of text messages. He accused her of being tied down and too scared to live. Those words, investigators believed, triggered her breaking point. In the early morning hours, Heather used meth, pacing the house while Axel slept. Sometime before dawn, she retrieved a bottle of isopropyl alcohol from under the bathroom sink. What happened next, prosecutors argued, was deliberate. She pressed a soaked wipe or cloth over her son's mouth and nose until he stopped struggling. The act took only minutes, but it ended a young life and destroyed countless others. The next day, Heather attempted to stage the scene to look like a medical emergency. She called 911, her voice trembling, describing her son as blue and not breathing. But even in the chaos of the moment, her words seemed rehearsed. When paramedics arrived, she was wearing makeup, her hair freshly brushed, a detail investigators later noted as strange for a mother in shock. At the hospital, she showed minimal emotion, occasionally chatting with staff about unrelated matters. Doctors who tried to console her recalled that she seemed more concerned about how it looked than about what had happened. Meanwhile, Joseph Reynolds was shattered. He arrived at the hospital too late to see Axel alive. When police informed him of the autopsy results, his world collapsed. The woman he had loved and trusted, the mother of his child, was now the primary suspect in his son's murder. In later interviews, Joseph described feeling haunted by moments he had ignored. Heather's erratic behavior, her unexplained absences, the nights she stayed up long after everyone else was asleep. He had attributed it to stress, never imagining it was addiction or worse. The investigation into Heather's affair exposed even more disturbing elements. Robert Keown, when questioned, showed no remorse. He admitted their relationship was complicated and that Heather was intense, but denied knowing anything about Axel's death. Detectives, however, found a pattern of manipulation in their exchanges. Robert had repeatedly told Heather she was a bad mother and that her son would always come first unless she did something about it. Though prosecutors never charged him directly in connection to the murder, his influence over Heather became a central theme of the case. A toxic mix of emotional control and shared addiction that blurred the line between love and destruction. As the case gained media attention, the community turned against Heather. The image of a young mother who appeared cheerful on social media, posting photos of Axel with captions like, "My little man, my whole world," clashed violently with the allegations of murder. Reporters flooded the quiet neighborhood. Friends distanced themselves. Even Heather's family, once supportive, began to falter under the weight of the evidence. Her mother wept outside the courthouse, telling reporters she no longer recognized her daughter. In the months leading up to the trial, Heather's attorneys crafted their defense around two main points: grief and addiction. They argued that Heather was a broken woman battling substance abuse and that Axel's death was a tragic accident, not a deliberate act. They claimed she had been cleaning the house with rubbing alcohol and that the chemical traces found on her son were the result of a misguided attempt to revive him. But prosecutors countered with the scientific evidence, the suffocation marks, the absence of accidental causes, and the damning text messages. Forensic experts testified that the alcohol found on Axel's face couldn't have come from a simple wipe-down. It had been used in a way consistent with smothering. Toxicologists confirmed that Heather had methamphetamine in her system the night before and the morning of Axel's death, a state that could heighten aggression and cloud judgment. But even drug-induced confusion couldn't explain the cold, calculated steps she took afterward. The cleanup, the phone call, the deliberate story she told police. In the courtroom, Heather sat quietly, often staring straight ahead as the prosecution detailed her every move. The jury saw photos of Axel, smiling, full of life, and heard his father's emotional testimony about the night he lost his son. When Joseph described seeing Heather in handcuffs for the first time, his voice cracked. "I couldn't look at her," he said. "I didn't know who she was anymore." The trial revealed a haunting psychological portrait of Heather Reynolds, a woman torn between her roles as mother, wife, and lover, spiraling deeper into addiction and self-deception. She wasn't a cold-blooded killer in the traditional sense. She was something arguably more terrifying, a mother who convinced herself that love justified murder. By the end of Part 2 in this unfolding tragedy, the narrative had shifted from suspicion to certainty. The evidence spoke louder than her tears, and her attempts at denial began to crumble. What began as a story of a grieving mother was transforming into a cautionary tale of moral collapse. And as the prosecution prepared its closing arguments, one chilling truth loomed over the courtroom. Heather Reynolds hadn't lost her child in an accident. She had chosen to take his life. As the trial entered its final phase, the courtroom fell into a rhythm of silence and tension that only deepened with each day of testimony. Every seat was filled, every camera lens fixed on the woman at the center of it all. Heather Reynolds sat motionless, her once carefully curated image, bright blonde hair, polished nails, suburban poise, now replaced by the hollow gaze of a woman confronting the weight of her choices. Gone were the whispers of doubt about her guilt. The evidence had spoken, and the story it told was darker than anyone had imagined. The prosecution's closing argument was methodical and devastating. They painted Heather not as an impulsive killer, but as a woman who made a deliberate, selfish decision. She saw her child as an obstacle, the prosecutor said, pacing slowly before the jury. An obstacle to her affair, an obstacle to her addiction, an obstacle to the fantasy life she believed she deserved. He paused, glancing at the jurors, his voice softening. But Axel Reynolds wasn't an obstacle. He was a 3-year-old boy who loved his mother, who trusted her completely. And she betrayed that trust in the most unimaginable way. The courtroom sat in absolute stillness as photos of Axel filled the projection screen. His small hands gripping a toy car, his bright eyes fixed on the camera. The contrast between that innocent face and the brutality of his death was almost unbearable. Members of the jury wiped tears from their eyes. Even seasoned reporters found themselves looking away. The prosecutor's words echoed like a verdict before the verdict. She didn't lose control. She made a choice. Heather's defense tried one final plea for mercy. Her attorney, visibly tense, argued that Heather was a victim of her own addiction, a woman spiraling out of control who never intended to harm her child. He described her as broken, desperate, and delusional, insisting that what happened that morning was an accident compounded by panic and drug-induced confusion. He asked the jury to consider her mental state, her grief, her alleged remorse. "She's not a monster," he said quietly. "She's a mother who lost everything." But the prosecution countered with a simple, unshakable truth. Remorse never came. In the weeks after Axel's death, Heather didn't seek help or express guilt. Instead, she continued using meth, continued seeing her lover, and continued crafting a story designed to save herself. Detectives testified that she showed more concern about her reputation than her son's funeral arrangements. Even after being charged, she told friends she was confident she'd beat this, because they can't prove anything. To the jury, those words carried the cold ring of indifference. When it came time for deliberation, the jurors took only a few hours. Their decision was unanimous. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, endangering the welfare of a child, and drug possession. Heather showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. She stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Behind her, Joseph Reynolds broke down, his quiet sobs filling the room. The man who had once built a life with her now sat surrounded by strangers, mourning not just his son, but the woman who had destroyed their family. Sentencing came a month later. The judge's tone was grave as he addressed Heather directly. "You had a duty," he said, "a sacred duty, to protect, nurture, and love your child. Instead, you extinguished a life that depended entirely on you. There is no justification, no defense, no excuse for what you have done." With that, he imposed the maximum penalty: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Heather's face remained frozen as the words sank in. There would be no second chance, no redemption in freedom, only the echo of what she'd done. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered in quiet disbelief. Reporters broadcast live updates as neighbors expressed their horror. Some spoke of Heather's charm, how she'd once seemed like the perfect mother. Others admitted they had seen signs: her mood swings, her erratic behavior, the nights she screamed in the street, but had never imagined they pointed to something so horrific. In Gloucester Township, a small memorial was built for Axel. A teddy bear, a few toy cars, and a photo of the smiling boy who should have grown up surrounded by love. As the media dissected every detail of the case, the story of Heather Reynolds became a symbol of a deeper societal tragedy. Experts spoke about addiction and its power to distort reality, how methamphetamine could warp love into dependency and motherhood into burden. Others discussed the psychology of maternal filicide, the rare, horrifying phenomenon of mothers who kill their children. But even among those explanations, one fact remained unshakable: Heather's actions were not an accident. They were a decision driven by selfishness and obsession. In the months after her sentencing, fragments of Heather's life surfaced through court documents and interviews. In jail, she remained isolated, often refusing to speak with counselors. Letters from her to friends revealed a woman trapped between denial and delusion. "They made me out to be evil," she wrote in one note. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But those who knew the case best, detectives, prosecutors, even her former friends, saw it differently. One investigator put it bluntly: "She didn't lose her mind. She lost her conscience." Joseph Reynolds eventually moved away from Camden County, unable to bear the memories that lingered in every street and shadow of their old home. In rare interviews, he spoke of Axel not as a victim, but as a little boy who loved animals, music, and peanut butter sandwiches. "He was gentle," Joseph said quietly. "He just wanted to be loved." He avoided mentioning Heather's name, saying only that the person he married died long before the verdict. His life became a quiet tribute to his son, living on for him, carrying the memory of what had been taken away. Years later, the case of Heather Reynolds continued to appear in documentaries and crime series, each one trying to unravel the same haunting question: what drives a mother to kill her own child? In the retelling, experts often pointed to the perfect storm of addiction, infidelity, and emotional detachment. But none of those explanations could make sense of the core horror: that maternal love, something sacred and instinctive, could be smothered by desire and selfishness. The prison system confirmed that Heather adjusted poorly to life behind bars. Inmates described her as withdrawn, often spending long hours staring at the walls of her cell. She rarely participated in rehabilitation programs and spoke little of her son. The woman who once sought freedom through destruction had found herself trapped in the ultimate confinement, alone with her guilt and the silence of her choices. For the community of Gloucester Township, the tragedy left a lasting scar. Teachers who had known Axel spoke at school assemblies about the importance of noticing signs of distress, of not ignoring the quiet red flags in struggling families. Churches held vigils, parents clutched their children tighter, and the town once defined by ordinary suburban calm carried the memory of that small boy whose life had been stolen. In the end, Heather Reynolds' story became more than a criminal case. It was a cautionary tale about how unchecked addiction and emotional emptiness can erode humanity itself. Behind the sensational headlines and courtroom drama lay the simple, devastating truth of a child who trusted the wrong person to keep him safe. And so, in the sterile quiet of a prison cell, Heather Reynolds lives out her DESA life sentence not just by law, but by memory. Each sunrise behind bars marks another day of a freedom she once sought so desperately, and now will never know. Outside, the world moves on, but the story of Axel Reynolds remains. A whisper of innocence lost, a life too brief, and a reminder of how love, when poisoned by obsession, can turn deadly. In a quiet Georgia neighborhood, two families lived side by side, sharing meals, laughter, and friendship. But behind one neighbor's smile hid obsession, deceit, and a deadly plan. This is the shocking true story of love turned lethal, where jealousy and manipulation led to an unimaginable betrayal and murder. The morning sun rose gently over Grovetown, Georgia, casting soft light on the quiet suburban neighborhood where the Parsons family lived. It was the kind of community where people waved to each other from driveways, where kids played in open yards, and where everyone knew the names of the families next door. To the casual observer, life on Deer Hollow Run seemed peaceful, safe, and ordinary. But behind the closed doors of two neighboring houses, a deadly obsession was taking shape, one that would soon turn this serene street into a crime scene that would horrify an entire town. Kay Parsons was the kind of woman people remembered for her warmth. Friends described her as gentle, devoted to her husband David and their young son, and deeply rooted in family values. She worked hard to maintain a happy home, cooking dinners from scratch, helping at her child's school, and finding time for church gatherings. Her home was filled with laughter and stability, the kind that comes from trust and love. Next door lived Rebecca "Becky" Sears, a 43-year-old mother of two grown sons. On the surface, she was friendly, chatty, and often helpful, someone who could strike up a conversation at any hour. Becky and her sons had become almost like family to the Parsons. Their homes were open to each other, and Kay often welcomed them in without hesitation. David Parsons, Kay's husband, was a hard-working man, known for his good manners and dependability. He often helped neighbors with small repairs, and Becky, who lived alone with her sons after a rough divorce, seemed especially grateful for his kindness. What started as small favors, fixing a leaky faucet, helping with a broken fence, gradually evolved into something deeper. Over time, David and Becky began exchanging more than polite conversation. The line between neighborly concern and romantic interest blurred, and a secret affair began to take root. The relationship between David and Becky grew in secrecy. For Becky, it became an obsession. She told friends she finally felt loved again after years of loneliness, that David was her chance at happiness. But her affection quickly turned possessive. She wanted David entirely to herself, to share not just moments but a future. Yet that dream had one obstacle: Kay Parsons. Becky couldn't stand the idea of David returning each night to the woman who, in her mind, didn't deserve him. The envy festered, transforming into anger and then into something darker. As the affair continued, Becky's behavior became increasingly erratic. She began confiding in her son, Christopher Bowers, a 20-year-old with a history of emotional instability and poor judgment. Christopher had always lived under his mother's control, eager to please her but easily swayed. He wanted her approval more than anything. Becky exploited that weakness. She told him stories about how Kay had hurt her, how Kay was cruel, how the world would be better if Kay were gone. Over weeks, she began to manipulate him with promises, money, gifts, even affection, twisting his loyalty into a weapon. Christopher was not a born killer, but he was vulnerable. Those close to him later said he had always struggled to assert himself, constantly looking to his mother for direction. Becky's words were like commands, and Christopher, desperate to please her, began to accept her dark fantasies as possible reality. The two started discussing ways to get rid of Kay Parsons, not yet in concrete terms, but in whispers of hatred and jealousy. Becky convinced herself that once Kay was gone, David would choose her, and they could live openly as a couple. In the weeks before the murder, neighbors noticed subtle shifts. Becky became secretive and withdrawn, while Kay seemed unaware of the danger growing just next door. Christopher, meanwhile, started acting strange, nervous, agitated, and unpredictable. One neighbor recalled seeing him pacing outside late at night, muttering to himself. Another noticed Becky buying cleaning supplies and new clothes for her son, claiming they were starting fresh, but no one could have imagined what that phrase really meant. On the morning of March 25, 2009, Kay Parsons was home alone. Her husband had gone to work, and her son was at school. It was a quiet Wednesday morning like any other. Surveillance cameras from nearby homes later showed Christopher walking down the street around that time, dressed in dark clothing. What happened next was a storm of violence so ferocious that even seasoned investigators would later call it one of the most brutal attacks they had seen. Christopher broke into the Parsons home through a back door. He moved quickly, perhaps hesitating at first, but the manipulation of his mother echoed in his mind. He grabbed a hammer and a baseball bat, tools found inside the house, and attacked Kay as she turned in shock. The assault was relentless. Every blow seemed to carry not just his rage, but his mother's poisonous influence. When it was over, Kay lay unconscious, bleeding heavily from multiple head injuries. Christopher tried to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, scattering jewelry and prying at a door to stage a break-in. Then he fled, leaving behind a scene of horror. Hours later, when a friend discovered Kay's body, emergency responders rushed to the home, but it was too late. The community that had once been defined by friendship and trust was now filled with police tape and sirens. Detectives arrived, immediately noting inconsistencies. The forced entry seemed fake, the valuables were untouched, and nothing about the crime suggested a random burglar. It felt personal. The brutality, the location, the timing, all pointed toward someone who knew Kay. As investigators began to piece together the evidence, whispers of Becky Sears' closeness to the family reached their ears. Police began interviewing neighbors, friends, and co-workers, slowly uncovering the affair between David Parsons and Becky. The motive was starting to form, though the details were still hazy. Meanwhile, Becky acted calm, too calm. She showed up to check on David, offered sympathy, and cried in public. But those tears, investigators would later say, seemed rehearsed. Detectives obtained phone records, tracing calls and messages exchanged between Becky and her son in the days before and after the murder. The timing was suspicious. Becky had called Christopher repeatedly on the morning of the attack, then again that afternoon, asking him if everything was handled. When confronted, both denied involvement, but the story didn't hold. Small inconsistencies began to pile up. Christopher's torn clothing, unexplained scratches, and Becky's sudden change in behavior. The peaceful image of suburban harmony was collapsing. Behind every friendly smile and every borrowed cup of sugar had lurked a betrayal so deep it defied belief. By the time investigators were done gathering evidence, they realized this was no random act of violence. It was the result of a mother's obsession, a son's blind devotion, and a neighbor's trust turned fatal. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose every secret, every lie, and every tragic choice that had led to Kay Parsons' murder. What began as an affair rooted in loneliness had spiraled into a deadly conspiracy. And as detectives prepared to bring in their suspects, they had no idea just how dark the truth would become. The investigation into Kay Parsons' murder quickly intensified. Detectives from Columbia County Sheriff's Office knew they were dealing with something far more personal than a burglary gone wrong. Every inch of the crime scene was analyzed, the forced entry, the scattered jewelry, the pattern of bloodstains. Nothing about it fit the behavior of a random intruder. The brutality of the attack told a story of rage, of something emotional and deeply motivated. The killer hadn't come to steal, he'd come to destroy. Detectives began reconstructing Kay's final hours. They learned that on the morning of her death, Kay had spoken to a friend on the phone and mentioned feeling fine, even cheerful. There were no signs of tension or fear. That detail suggested she hadn't expected danger. She likely knew her killer. Forensic teams matched fingerprints and shoe prints found inside the home, leading them to rule out a stranger almost immediately. Suspicion naturally turned toward those closest to her. Neighbors began telling police about the close relationship between the Parsons family and their next-door neighbor, Rebecca Sears. Many described Becky as too involved, frequently stopping by unannounced and behaving possessively toward David Parsons. When detectives questioned David, he reluctantly admitted he had been having an affair with Becky, a revelation that instantly reframed the investigation. The motive now had a face. Detectives wondered, had Becky's jealousy reached a point where she'd wanted Kay out of the way for good? David Parsons appeared devastated. His wife was dead, and the woman he'd been seeing was suddenly under suspicion. He told police he'd ended the affair weeks before the murder, trying to repair his marriage. But investigators later discovered that Becky had refused to accept the breakup. Text messages from her phone revealed a pattern of obsession. She had written to David dozens of times a day, begging to see him, accusing him of lying, and even threatening that Kay will regret coming between us. That phrase stood out like a warning. When detectives brought Becky in for questioning, she was polite but defensive. She denied any involvement and claimed to be heartbroken over Kay's death. She wept in front of officers and said she couldn't imagine anyone hurting her friend. But her performance raised eyebrows. Her timeline didn't align with her phone records, and her attempts to redirect suspicion elsewhere seemed forced. She couldn't explain why her car had been seen leaving her driveway around the time of the murder. Nor could she account for several calls made to her son Christopher during those critical hours. Attention quickly shifted to Christopher Bowers. Detectives learned that the 20-year-old had been struggling with mental health issues and drug use. Friends described him as troubled but not violent until recently. They recalled Becky often speaking for him, controlling where he went, and even dictating his friendships. One friend said, "He did whatever his mom wanted, no matter what." When police located Christopher, he appeared anxious and confused. His hands bore faint scratches, and he avoided eye contact. During his first interview, Christopher denied everything. He claimed he'd been home that morning, sleeping. But when detectives presented surveillance footage showing someone resembling him walking toward the Parsons residence, his composure cracked. Within hours, he asked for a break, then whispered to the officer, "She told me to do it." Those 6 words changed the direction of the entire case. Christopher's confession was both shocking and heartbreaking. He said his mother had been obsessed with David Parsons for months and had grown increasingly angry at Kay. Becky, he claimed, constantly complained that Kay was in the way and that she needed to be gone. She manipulated her son's emotions, convincing him that helping her would fix everything and make their lives better. She offered him cash, drugs, and even the promise that they could move somewhere new afterward. She said it would be quick, Christopher told investigators. She said no one would ever know. In his statement, Christopher described entering the Parsons home through the back door, attacking Kay when she screamed, and staging the scene to make it look like a robbery. He admitted Becky had planned everything, even telling him what to wear and how to clean up. He said she waited for him to return home, helped him dispose of his clothes, and later acted like nothing had happened. Detectives corroborated parts of his story with phone data and physical evidence. The calls between Becky and Christopher during the murder window were undeniable. Becky was arrested the same night Christopher confessed. When confronted with her son's statement, she remained stone-faced. For hours, she denied his accusations, claiming he was lying to protect someone else. But the mountain of evidence was closing in. Her phone records placed her at home, calling Christopher repeatedly. Her fingerprints were found on a jewelry box that had been scattered at the fake burglary scene. She could no longer maintain the illusion of innocence. As the case moved toward trial, the courtroom became a stage for 2 contrasting images of the same woman. The defense painted Becky as a loving mother who had no control over her unstable son. They claimed Christopher acted alone, driven by drug use and resentment. The prosecution, however, described her as the mastermind, a manipulative woman who used her son as a weapon to eliminate her romantic rival. The jury saw a woman who sat cold and detached, showing no remorse for what her son had done in her name. Christopher's defense attorneys portrayed him as a victim of his mother's psychological abuse. They presented evidence that Becky had long manipulated him, isolating him from friends, controlling his money, and feeding him lies about the Parsons family. One of his childhood friends testified. He worshipped her. He couldn't think for himself. If she said something was right, it was right to him. Experts called by the prosecution agreed. Christopher was impressionable, but he knew right from wrong. He had made a choice, a terrible one, but it was Becky's influence that set the plan in motion. In the community, disbelief turned to outrage. People struggled to understand how a mother could use her own child to commit such a heinous act. Kay Parsons' family attended every hearing, often sitting silently, clutching photographs of her. Her husband, David, rarely spoke publicly. When he did, his voice broke as he described his guilt and regret for the affair that had ignited Becky's obsession. He said, "If I could take it back, I would give anything. She didn't deserve what happened to her." The trial uncovered one final, chilling detail. Becky had told another friend weeks before the murder that she had a way to fix everything. At the time, no one took her seriously. But when prosecutors replayed that conversation in court, it became clear she had been planning Kay's death long before the attack. Every call, every conversation, every manipulation had led to that single morning in March. By the time closing arguments began, the evidence against Becky Sears was overwhelming. Prosecutors described her as a woman driven by obsession, jealousy, and delusion. They said she turned her son into an instrument of murder, convincing him it was an act of love. The defense's attempts to shift blame fell flat. The jury could see through her tears, her denials, and her attempts to portray herself as a grieving neighbor. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Becky Sears was found guilty of murder, burglary, and conspiracy. Christopher Bowers, having taken a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, received life in prison. As officers led Becky away, she turned toward her son and whispered something no one could hear. Christopher stared at her, his expression empty. A mixture of anger, confusion, and the realization that the woman he had trusted most had destroyed his life as well as another's. For the people of Grovetown, justice had come, but peace did not. The betrayal cut too deep, the violence too senseless. Two homes that once shared laughter now stood as grim reminders of what envy and manipulation could do. But for detectives, prosecutors, and everyone who had followed the case, one question still lingered. How far can love twist before it turns into something unrecognizable? Something deadly? In the aftermath of the trial, Grovetown struggled to reclaim a sense of normalcy. The shockwaves of Kay Parsons' murder reverberated far beyond her family's home. The small Georgia town, once defined by trust and close-knit neighbors, had become synonymous with betrayal and tragedy. People who had once exchanged smiles over white fences now closed their doors a little earlier, spoke in hushed tones, and looked warily at the houses next to them. The story of Rebecca Sears and Christopher Bowers had revealed something that unsettled everyone. That evil can hide behind a friendly face, that manipulation can live inside a family, and that love, when poisoned by jealousy, can turn lethal. Inside the county jail, Rebecca Sears remained defiant. Those who visited her in the early days of her incarceration said she refused to take responsibility. She told anyone who would listen that her son had twisted everything, and that the police wanted someone to blame. She even wrote letters to old friends, insisting that she was innocent, that Christopher had acted on his own after misunderstanding her pain. But no one believed her anymore. Her words, once persuasive, had lost their power. The community saw her not as a heartbroken woman but as a manipulator who had weaponized her own child to carry out her darkest desire. Christopher, meanwhile, had become a ghost of the person he once was. Isolated in a cell, he spent his days writing letters he never sent. He told prison psychologists that he dreamed of his mother's voice, sometimes scolding him, sometimes comforting him. He confessed that he didn't understand where her influence ended and his own will began. "I thought I was helping her," he once said during an evaluation. "I thought she needed me." His statement encapsulated the tragedy at the heart of the case. A young man so warped by control that he mistook murder for devotion. For investigators who had spent months untangling the evidence, the case left emotional scars. Detectives who had walked through the Parsons home that March morning said they would never forget the brutality they witnessed. The blood, the staged break-in, the eerie silence of a house once full of life. All of it painted a portrait of cruelty beyond comprehension. One officer later said, "You expect evil to have a certain look, but it doesn't. It can smile at you from the house next door." That truth lingered long after the case was closed. Kay Parsons' family tried to move forward, though the loss was unbearable. Her son, too young to fully understand why his mother was gone, grew up surrounded by memories of her kindness and laughter. David Parsons, the man whose affair had sparked the chain of events, lived with a crushing sense of guilt. He withdrew from public life, rarely speaking about the case except to express remorse. Friends said he visited Kay's grave often, leaving flowers and sitting in silence for hours. He knew that while Becky and Christopher had delivered the fatal blows, his choices had paved the road to tragedy. The affair that had seemed like a secret escape had instead destroyed 3 lives and fractured 2 families beyond repair. In court documents and trial transcripts, the case became known simply as the Grovetown Love Triangle murder. But for those who lived through it, it was far more than a headline. It was a cautionary tale about the dangerous mix of obsession and manipulation. Experts who later studied the case pointed to the dynamic between Becky and her son as a textbook example of coercive control. A mother who used emotional dependency to bend her child's moral compass. Psychological evaluations revealed that Becky had displayed traits of narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders, showing little empathy and a deep need for control. She saw people not as individuals, but as extensions of her will. Christopher was her most tragic victim. Years later, true crime documentaries revisited the story, piecing together interviews with detectives, neighbors, and legal experts. The narration painted a chilling picture. A woman so consumed by jealousy that she convinced her son to kill the woman who stood in her way. One of the lead investigators described it best. "Becky didn't just take Kay's life. She stole her son's too. She made him her weapon. And in the end, he was destroyed right along with his victim." In prison, Becky's relationship with Christopher completely deteriorated. At first, she tried to contact him through letters, urging him to forgive her and claiming that he had misunderstood her intentions. But Christopher refused to reply. Over time, his resentment grew into a quiet, heavy hatred. During one prison interview years later, when asked if he still thought about his mother, he said, "Every day, I think about what she did to me and what I did for her." His voice broke when he added, "I just wanted her to love me." The parole hearings for both came and went, but the outcome never changed. Becky Sears remained behind bars, serving life without the possibility of release. Christopher, under his plea deal, faced decades before he could even be considered. Neither would ever again walk freely in the town they had once called home. For the people of Grovetown, that was justice, imperfect but final. In the years that followed, Kay's story became a symbol of how deception can destroy even the most ordinary lives. Her friends established a small memorial garden in her honor, planting flowers each spring near the local park she used to visit with her son. Her name was engraved on a bench there, alongside the words, "Loved, remembered, and never forgotten." Each year on the anniversary of her death, neighbors gathered quietly to light candles and reflect, not just on her life, but on the fragility of trust. What made the case unforgettable wasn't just the murder itself, but the emotional layers beneath it. A mother's manipulation, a son's blind obedience, and a husband's fatal mistake. It forced people to confront uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know the people living beside us? How far will someone go when consumed by jealousy? And how easily can love twist into something monstrous? For law enforcement, it became a lesson in looking beyond the obvious. Detectives who had initially treated the case as a home invasion learned that evil sometimes hides in plain sight, disguised by familiarity. It also became a point of study for psychologists examining familial influence and coercion. The relationship between Becky Sears and Christopher Bowers was dissected in academic papers, cited as an extreme case of maternal domination, proof that control, when combined with emotional manipulation, can erode morality entirely. Even today, the story of the Parsons murder remains etched into Georgia's true crime history. It's told not just as a murder case but as a tragic intersection of obsession, guilt, and betrayal. The image of Kay, the trusting wife, the devoted mother, the neighbor who opened her door to everyone, serves as a haunting reminder of how innocence can be exploited by those closest to us. Her life ended in violence, but her story continues to resonate as a warning. Love without boundaries can become possession, and possession can become destruction. In the final analysis, this was never just a story of murder. It was a story of two women connected by one man, of choices made in secrecy and lies that spiraled out of control. It was about a son who became a killer to please the mother he trusted and a woman whose greed for affection consumed her completely. And in the end, it was about the irreversible cost of deception. One woman dead, one son lost, and one mother forever branded as the architect of a nightmare that began with an affair and ended with blood on the floor of a quiet Georgia home. In a quiet Texas town, two church-going mothers shared secrets, smiles, and a deadly connection. When jealousy ignited betrayal, one woman's rage turned a suburban home into a scene of unimaginable horror. This is the shocking true story of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore, a friendship that ended with 41 axe blows. In the quiet sprawl of Wiley, Texas, 1980 began like any other year. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other from freshly mowed lawns, and the rhythm of life revolved around church gatherings and family dinners. Beneath the warmth of that small-town charm, though, a quiet discontent brewed in the life of one woman who seemed to have everything. Candy Montgomery was the picture of suburban normalcy, a 30-year-old wife and mother who was as reliable as she was sociable. She volunteered at the local Methodist church, hosted Bible study sessions, and always had a smile for anyone who crossed her path. But what no one saw was the gnawing emptiness that had begun to take hold of her. Her husband, Pat Montgomery, worked long hours as an engineer at Texas Instruments. He was intelligent and steady but emotionally reserved, and over time, their marriage had grown routine. Their conversations were mostly about their children, weekend plans, or finances, never about feelings or passion. Candy's days had become predictable. Cleaning, errands, cooking, church, and parenting. In her own words later, she described it as comfortable, but dull. There was no spark, no excitement, no reason to feel truly alive. That sense of restlessness set the stage for everything that followed. Around that same time, another couple in town was navigating their own struggles. Alan and Betty Gore had recently welcomed their second child, and the transition had not been easy. Betty, a quiet, reserved schoolteacher, was prone to anxiety and bouts of depression. She longed for reassurance, for closeness, but Alan's job as a computer technician often took him away from home. The distance between them widened in ways neither of them fully recognized until it was too late. Betty felt lonely and insecure, while Alan, though kind and gentle, found himself emotionally disconnected from the woman he had promised to love. It was through the church's social circle that Candy and Alan first met. Their paths crossed during Sunday school, church dinners, and volleyball games held in the church gymnasium. The chemistry between them wasn't immediate, but it was real. Candy noticed Alan's quiet demeanor, his kindness, and the way he listened, a rare quality in a world that often felt indifferent to her. One night after a volleyball game, she found herself standing close to him, their laughter trailing off into a silence that neither could quite explain. She would later recall that moment as the spark she'd been craving. Months passed before Candy made the bold move. During a routine drive after church, she told Alan plainly that she was attracted to him. It startled him, but the honesty lingered. Alan, though hesitant, was flattered. He admitted that the attraction was mutual but insisted they needed to be careful. Neither of them wanted to destroy their families. But temptation has a way of finding cracks in even the most disciplined lives. After weeks of deliberation, Candy proposed an affair, an arrangement with clear boundaries. No emotions, just physical intimacy. They would meet only when schedules allowed, always keeping their lives at home separate. They even created rules to ensure no one would get hurt. At first, it was a secret that felt strangely liberating. They met during lunch breaks at motels halfway between their homes, sharing sandwiches before and after their encounters to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Candy described those afternoons as thrilling, a brief escape from the monotony of her life. For Alan, it was a reprieve from the emotional strain at home. But what began as a harmless diversion soon became something much heavier. The secrecy, the stolen moments, the guilt, all of it began to weigh on both of them. By late 1979, Alan started to feel the consequences of his choices. Betty, though unaware of the affair, sensed something was off. She grew more anxious, suspicious, and desperate for reassurance. Meanwhile, Alan found himself torn between two worlds: his loyalty to his wife and family, and the excitement Candy offered him. The guilt gnawed at him. He began to pull away, choosing to focus on repairing his marriage. For Candy, the end of their affair felt like rejection. She agreed to the breakup, but the emotional fallout was far greater than she expected. In early 1980, Betty seemed determined to rebuild her marriage. She and Alan began attending church more regularly and spending more time together. When Betty gave birth to their second child, Alan became even more committed to his family. Candy, still a part of the same social circle, had to face them both frequently at church events and gatherings. It was an uncomfortable situation, a quiet reminder of the secret she could never fully escape. Behind her friendly smile, tension simmered. She tried to bury her emotions in church activities, community work, and her children's lives, but deep inside, she struggled to move on. As summer approached, life in Wiley continued as usual, or so it seemed. Candy's days were filled with errands and playdates, while Betty adjusted to life as a mother of two. The Montgomerys and Gores still crossed paths often. In a small town, avoidance was nearly impossible. Alan and Candy exchanged polite nods, pretending nothing had ever happened. But beneath those polite exchanges lay an unspoken history, a secret that hung over them like a shadow waiting for the right moment to reappear. That moment came on June 13, 1980. It began as an ordinary Friday morning. Candy planned to attend church events later that day, and one small task required her to stop by the Gore home. Betty's older daughter, Elisa, was spending the night with Candy's daughter, and Candy needed to pick up her swimsuit. It was a simple errand, nothing out of the ordinary. When Candy arrived, Betty greeted her calmly. There was no tension at first, but somewhere in the conversation, Betty brought up the subject that had been buried for months: the affair. Candy's heart began to race. She hadn't expected it, not like this. Betty asked directly if she had been intimate with Alan. Candy, perhaps believing honesty might end the discomfort, admitted it had happened but assured her it was long over. For a moment, Betty seemed to take it in silence. Then something in her changed. Anger took hold. What followed was not calm discussion but confrontation. A sudden surge of emotions that had been suppressed for too long. Neighbors would later recall hearing nothing unusual that morning, unaware that inside that quiet suburban home, two women were about to collide in an eruption of rage, fear, and desperation. The small-town piece of Wiley, Texas, was about to be shattered, and the name Candy Montgomery would soon become synonymous with one of the most shocking suburban crimes in American history. Inside the Gore home, the air was still, heavy with a tension neither woman could escape. Candy Montgomery stood in the small utility room, a space lined with laundry baskets and tools, while Betty Gore faced her, eyes burning with quiet fury. What began as a controlled confrontation had spiraled into something darker. Betty's voice trembled as she asked again, her words cutting through the silence. "Are you still seeing Alan?" Candy shook her head, insisting it was over, that it had been a mistake. But Betty wasn't convinced. She pressed harder, demanding details, her voice growing sharper with every question. The calm mask both women wore for years was gone. Beneath it, resentment and humiliation spilled out like something long repressed. Candy later recalled the moment Betty's anger transformed into something physical. In her testimony, she claimed Betty stepped out of the room briefly and returned holding an axe. To Candy, it was a threat, a warning to never come near her husband again. Betty told her, in a steady voice, to never see Alan again, and Candy promised she wouldn't. She wanted to leave to end the confrontation right there. But as she turned to go, Betty blocked her path. According to Candy, the tension erupted in an instant. A struggle for control, fear overtaking reason. What happened next would become one of the most disputed and disturbing moments in Texas criminal history. Candy claimed Betty swung the axe first, grazing her foot. In the chaos that followed, the two women wrestled for the weapon, the sound of labored breathing and shuffling feet filling the small room. At some point, Candy managed to seize control of the axe. Betty, screaming and crying, tried to push her away, but Candy swung. One strike turned into another and then another. The fury escalated beyond comprehension. The medical examiner would later reveal the full horror. Betty Gore had been struck 41 times. Many of the blows came after she was already on the ground, suggesting something beyond self-defense. The pattern of wounds told a story of blind rage. The handle of the axe was slick with blood, the walls splattered with the marks of violence. It was a frenzy no one could reconcile with the soft-spoken, church-going image of Candy Montgomery. When the last blow fell, silence returned to the room. The only sound left was Candy's own breath, ragged and uneven. She stood there for a moment, trembling, staring at what she'd done. Then, in an eerie calm, she set the axe aside. Candy's actions after the killing were methodical, almost detached. She walked to the bathroom, washed the blood from her hands, and cleaned herself up. She changed clothes and left the house, driving back into the Texas heat as if nothing had happened. On the surface, she looked composed, but inside she was unraveling. She stopped at church later that day for a Father's Day event, chatting politely, smiling when spoken to. No one suspected that just hours earlier she had committed one of the most brutal crimes the town would ever see. Back at the Gore home, an uneasy silence settled over the house. Betty's infant daughter, Bethany, was crying in her crib, alone, unfed, and frightened. Hours passed before anyone realized something was wrong. That evening, Alan, away on a business trip in Minnesota, tried calling home. There was no answer. Repeated attempts failed. He grew anxious, reaching out to neighbors to check on his wife. When they arrived, the house was dark. They found the baby's cries coming from the bedroom, and when they followed the sound to the utility room, they discovered the unimaginable. Blood covered the floor and walls, and Betty's body lay motionless. It was a scene of pure horror. One of the neighbors ran outside, pale and trembling, unable to speak. Another called the police. Within minutes, sirens pierced the quiet streets of Wiley. Officers who entered the home described it as one of the most violent crime scenes they had ever encountered. Betty's body was barely recognizable, the axe still lying nearby. To the small-town police department, this wasn't just a murder, it was a massacre. Investigators immediately began piecing together the events leading to Betty's death. There were no signs of forced entry or robbery. Nothing appeared stolen. The brutality suggested a crime of passion, not premeditated murder for gain. As they began questioning neighbors and friends, one name kept resurfacing: Candy Montgomery. She was the last known person to see Betty alive. That evening, Alan returned to Wiley and was met by detectives. Still in shock, he struggled to process what had happened. When asked if his wife had any enemies, Alan hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he revealed the affair with Candy. The officers listened, noting every word. The connection between the two women was now clear, and the motive, jealousy, and betrayal began to form. The next day, detectives visited Candy's home. She greeted them politely, her demeanor calm. She didn't appear surprised by their questions. When they asked if she'd seen Betty that morning, she admitted she had, but claimed it was only to pick up a swimsuit. As the conversation continued, detectives noticed small details: scratches on Candy's feet, her nervous gestures, the inconsistencies in her timeline. Later that night, they obtained a warrant. Candy Montgomery was arrested on suspicion of murder. The town of Wiley was stunned. News spread like wildfire. A church volunteer, mother, and friend accused of killing another woman with an axe. It seemed impossible. Neighbors who once waved from their driveways now whispered behind closed doors. Television crews arrived, reporters swarmed, and soon the quiet town was transformed into a media circus. During questioning, Candy initially denied everything. But under the weight of evidence and the emotional strain, she confessed partially. She admitted to killing Betty but insisted it was self-defense. She claimed Betty attacked her first, that she feared for her life. The police struggled to make sense of her calm tone as she described the incident. It didn't sound like panic or fear. It sounded almost detached, rehearsed. By the time the case went to trial, it had captivated not only Texas but the entire nation. Reporters called it the Wiley Axe murder, a case that blurred the line between self-defense and savagery. How could a woman like Candy, who baked cookies for church fundraisers, commit such an act? Psychologists, legal experts, and neighbors alike tried to answer that question. Some said she was pushed beyond her limits, trapped by emotional suffocation. Others saw her as calculating and cold. In the weeks leading to trial, the community grew divided. Church members who once prayed together now sat on opposite sides of moral outrage. Betty's friends demanded justice. Candy's supporters insisted she was a victim of circumstance. The stage was set for one of the most controversial courtroom dramas Texas had ever seen. A battle not just over guilt, but over the nature of control, repression, and what can happen when a person's hidden emotions finally erupt. The trial that followed would expose far more than just the details of that deadly morning. It would peel back the layers of a quiet community and reveal the fragile human impulses buried beneath its polite surface. The truth, however subjective, was about to come out, and it would leave everyone asking how far an ordinary person can go when pushed past the point of no return. The trial of Candy Montgomery began in October 1980 at the Collin County Courthouse, and almost overnight, it became the center of national attention. Journalists from across the country filled the courtroom, their cameras aimed at the woman whose name had come to symbolize the unthinkable violence that had shattered suburban tranquility. Candy Montgomery sat beside her defense attorney, Don Crowder, her expression calm, almost unreadable. She wore modest clothes, her hair neatly brushed, looking more like a PDA volunteer than a woman accused of hacking another to death with an axe. But behind that composed exterior was a story that no one could quite comprehend. A tale of passion, guilt, and psychological unraveling. The prosecution built its case on the brutality of the act. They showed photographs of the crime scene. Blood splattered on the walls, Betty Gore's lifeless body on the floor, the axe lying just inches away. Each image was a reminder of the sheer savagery of the crime. 41 blows, the prosecutor emphasized, were not the result of panic or self-defense but rage. Uncontrolled, deliberate, personal. They argued that Candy had gone to Betty's house that morning not for a swimsuit but to silence her, to end the threat of exposure once and for all. In their view, the murder was not spontaneous but the violent climax of a long, dangerous affair. The defense countered with a very different story. Don Crowder, known for his theatrical style, argued that Candy had no history of violence, no motive for murder, and no benefit from Betty's death. Instead, he painted a portrait of a woman pushed to the edge by emotional confrontation and childhood trauma. The defense's key witness was psychiatrist Dr. Fred Faison, who claimed Candy had suffered a dissociative reaction, a psychological break triggered by fear. According to Dr. Faison, when Betty confronted Candy and allegedly attacked her, something deep within Candy snapped. In that moment, she was not fully conscious of her actions. She had been transported back to a repressed memory from childhood, one in which she had been punished harshly for expressing anger. That buried fear, the psychiatrist explained, erupted violently when Betty attacked. causing Candy to lose control completely. Crowder knew the case would hinge on whether the jury could believe this explanation. He encouraged Candy to testify despite the risk. When she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke softly, describing how she and Betty had struggled in the utility room, how fear overtook her, and how the first blow was in self-defense. As she spoke, her voice cracked, and the audience leaned forward, drawn in by the unexpected vulnerability of a woman accused of unspeakable violence. She described hearing Betty's baby crying in the next room, but in her panic, she said, she couldn't stop herself. Each strike of the axe, she claimed, was an act of terror, not intent. The courtroom listened in disbelief. Some jurors wept quietly as Candy described losing awareness of what she was doing. Others looked away, shaken by the gruesome details. When she finished, the silence was heavy, broken only by the shuffling of papers. The prosecutor rose to cross-examine her, attacking her calm demeanor, questioning how someone could commit such an act and still appear so composed afterward. Candy maintained her composure, insisting that she hadn't meant to kill Betty, that she had simply lost control in a moment of fear and confusion. The testimony polarized the public. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, holding signs demanding justice for Betty Gore. Reporters described Wiley as a town divided between outrage and disbelief. Some residents defended Candy, saying they couldn't believe she was capable of such brutality. Others saw the defense as a manipulation of psychology and theatrics, a way to excuse the inexcusable. The trial became not just about Candy Montgomery, but about the fragile facade of suburban perfection and the hidden pressures within it. After days of testimony and heated exchanges, the case went to the jury. For hours, they deliberated over two conflicting realities: the image of Candy as a frightened woman acting in self-defense, and the brutal evidence of over 40 axe blows. On October 30th, 1980, the courtroom filled to capacity as the jury filed back in. The foreman rose, holding the verdict. The room fell silent. "We find the defendant, Candace Montgomery, not guilty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Betty's friends and family sat frozen, tears streaming down their faces, unable to believe what they had heard. Candy's husband, Pat, exhaled deeply, his hand gripping hers. Reporters rushed out to break the story. Within minutes, headlines across the country declared the shocking verdict: a mother and church volunteer acquitted of one of the most brutal murders in Texas history. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in anger. Many shouted that justice had failed, that Betty Gore had been forgotten in a haze of courtroom drama and psychological jargon. Candy was escorted away under police protection, her expression blank as cameras flashed around her. That night, she returned home to a storm of attention. Calls from journalists, strangers, and even filmmakers hoping to tell her story. But Candy wanted none of it. In the months that followed, she and her family quietly left Wiley. They changed their names and relocated, trying to rebuild their lives far from the shadow of the trial. Pat eventually divorced her, unable to bear the weight of the past. Candy began working as a mental health counselor years later, helping others cope with trauma. An irony that wasn't lost on those who remembered her case. For the residents of Wiley, the wounds never fully healed. The Gore home was eventually sold, remodeled, and inhabited by new families. But locals said the air around it always felt heavy, haunted by memories of what had happened there. The church where the two women had once prayed side by side struggled to move past the tragedy. Its congregation forever changed by the realization that beneath smiles and Sunday sermons, something darker had existed all along. The case continued to capture public fascination for decades. Books, documentaries, and dramatizations revisited it, each asking the same questions. Was it self-defense or a calculated act of rage? Could a moment of psychological fracture truly explain 41 blows with an axe? Or was Candy Montgomery simply a woman who snapped under the pressure of guilt, fear, and emotional repression? In every retelling, one thing remains constant. The story of Candy and Betty serves as a haunting reminder of the hidden turmoil behind the polished surface of suburban life. The quiet desperation of a housewife, the loneliness of a mother, the longing for connection that spiraled into destruction. All became part of a cautionary tale about human vulnerability and the fine line between composure and chaos. Today, more than 4 decades later, the Wiley Axe murder remains one of America's most chilling true crime stories. It is not just the violence that keeps it alive in memory, but the unsettling truth it exposes. That even in the most ordinary of places, among the most ordinary of people, darkness can take root. A single moment, a confrontation, a secret revealed, can unravel a life completely. In the end, no verdict, no explanation, and no psychological theory could fully make sense of what happened that summer morning in 1980. Betty Gore's life ended in a room filled with rage, and Candy Montgomery's life was forever marked by it. The question of who the real victim was, Betty, Candy, or the illusion of peaceful suburban life, remains one that time has never been able to answer.